Yo, 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 what is going on, U.S. history people? This is Mr. Norris.
And Mr. Lorenc.
My main man, Mr. Lawrence. We're going to talk to you about video number 4 today in Launching a New Nation, the growth of the judicial branch, and Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Lawrence, I'm looking at Thomas Jefferson, and I notice an S is in his first name and an S in his last name. What does that mean?
That always reminds me of strict interpretation of the Constitution.
That's good, but we'll see today whether or not he stays strictly interpreting the Constitution.
Nice, a little foreshadowing.
Yeah, and the answer is no, by the way. All right, so the judicial branch. The power of the judicial branch was greatly increased under the period in which John Marshall, make sure you're writing down John Marshall, served as the nation's 4th Chief Justice, the longest running Chief Justice in U.S. history from 1801 to 1835. Mr. Lawrence, why is this important? Why do we care about John Marshall?
Because John Marshall is considered by many historians probably one of the most influential Chief Justices of the United States. And again, he was not the first, he was the 4th. But what's significant about is the time in which he was Chief Justice. From 1801 to 1835 is a long time to serve on the bench of the Supreme Court.
Do you think he knew Phil Notes by any chance?
He may have when he was going to school, telling him to fill in
those notes. So decisions made under the Marshall Court helped expand the power of the judicial branch along with the power of the national or the central or the federal government of the United States. We notice there are 2 stars there. That is so important to note, ladies and gentlemen. The Marshall Court expanded the power of the federal government. I'm going to say that one more time. The Marshall Court expanded the power of the national government. What did the Marshall Court expand, Mr. Lawrence?
I believe it was the power of the central, national, or federal, whatever you choose, government.
Good, very good. I'm stuck on one more thing before we move on. What did the 22nd Amendment do? I can't remember.
Oh, hold on. I remember this. 22nd two-term tradition was put into the Constitution.
So 2 terms for the president. Hopefully you remember that better than I do.
Nice. I dropped my pen. All right, major cases under the Marshall Court. What do we need to know? Well, obviously, Marbury versus Madison. We've talked about this. It seems like 100 times already in class, and we'll talk about it at least 500 more times before the end of the year. But why is it important? Well, it's the case that establishes judicial review, which we know allows the court to determine constitutionality of congressional actions or bills or laws, as well as executive actions.
Very good. Then we have Gibbons versus Ogden from 1824. So he is 10 years. He still has 10 years left in his tenure, Mr. John Marshall. And this states that regulating interstate trade, and that inter, I-N-T-E-R, means federal government. Remember, federal, E-R, inter, E-R. Interstate commerce, or trade between states, is a power reserved to the federal government, not the states. States can regulate intra-state commerce, which is trade within the state. So interstate, or 2 or more states, is only a power given to the federal government.
All right, so that leads us to the McCulloch versus Maryland case. So what this was is Maryland was attempting to tax the National Bank of the United States. The Supreme Court stepped in and ruled that the federal law was superior to state laws using the Supremacy Clause. So what this said is that the states could not tax that federal bank because of the Supremacy Clause. So if Congress passes a law, it is the law of the land as long as it's constitutional, and all states must follow what is passed.
In all cases, all these, whether it's Marbury, Gibbons, or McCulloch, or any other John Marshall case you could think of, they increase the power of the federal government. That is very important to note. It increases the power of the federal government. All right, ladies and gentlemen, there are 2 terms that we need to be familiar with here: judicial activism and judicial restraint. And this is something that is even talked about today in 2014. Or are we in 2015? I don't know, maybe 16? So judicial activism is the interpretation of the Constitution in an attempt to determine founders' intent with modern issues. So in other words, they're trying to figure out how would the founding fathers, what would their intent be with modern issues? And this can be a little tricky because there's so many issues around today that were not around back then. So sometimes if the Supreme Court takes a judicial activist approach, they tend to take a broader interpretation of the Constitution.
Some people even believe judicial activism is the court actually creating new laws in a way.
And we will see a couple examples later this year with that. Yes, absolutely.
All right, so on the other hand is what we refer to as judicial restraint. And what this is considered the literal interpretation of the Constitution. So judicial restraint, this is the other hand of judicial activism, is a literal interpretation of the Constitution. So this avoids going outside the wording of the Constitution. So again, it is read word for word. And if it does not exist within the Constitution, then that means it is unconstitutional. And if Congress or people within the United States want something done that's not in the Constitution, they need to go and amend the Constitution so it aligns with the Constitution.
So where will we see more examples of change? Would that be judicial restraint or judicial activism?
I would believe it would be judicial activism.
Absolutely, yes. Restraint, kind of keeping things the way they are. All right, let's go over to our third president, Thomas Jefferson. He became the third president of the U.S. after the election of 1800, defeating incumbent or the current president, John Adams. Jefferson was a devout Republican. He made several decisions that impacted the growth and development of the United States. Now, you all are familiar with the Louisiana Purchase, and it is this area here in green. And notice that it doubles the size of the United States. The old boundaries prior to the western boundary prior to the Louisiana Purchase was the Mississippi River right here. Now suddenly we go out to essentially the Rockies almost out west. So the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from the French, led by
Napoleon.
And this helped expand the U.S. physically.
All right, so what were some benefits of this? Well, two major benefits. One, doubled the size of the United States, as Mr. Norris already pointed out, but it also gave the United States total control of the Mississippi River that acted almost as the superhighway of this time period, allowing for travel north and south throughout parts of the North American continent, but also east and west through rivers and tributaries that really branch off the Mississippi. It was very important for the United States to control that waterway.
Look at you going all tributaries on us. All right, so Jefferson's view of the Constitution. What was Jefferson's original view of the Constitution? Mr. Lawrence, I see the letter S in there. What does that mean?
Strict.
He strictly interpreted the Constitution. So he did not want a strong central government that may limit liberty or freedom. So he was very weary of strong central governments. He strictly interpreted the Constitution.
So going back to study the Constitution, the question asks, according to the Constitution, who must approve treaties with foreign nations? And we know that's obviously the Senate. So Congress plays a role in creating these treaties, or excuse me, not creating, but ratifying these treaties, correct?
Absolutely. So Thomas Jefferson is kind of in a pickle here. So did Jefferson's actions during the Louisiana Purchase represent a shift in the view of the Constitution, and why? So in the Constitution, does it say the president can buy land?
No.
No, it does not. So if he were strictly interpreting it, he would not buy Louisiana, but he felt it was that important. So yes, this represents a shift. We see Thomas Jefferson going from a strict interpretation to a loose interpretation, and he increases the power of the executive branch under the idea of a treaty. And then he explores the Louisiana Territory with Lewis and Clark, and he does not ask Congress for their permission. So he flips from a strict interpretation to a loose interpretation. All right, that's it for video number 4. Please turn to your video response section of your packet, and next to video number 4, and at least 3 sentences answer the following question. How did the power of the federal government increase under John Marshall? Thank you guys for watching. Have a good day.